Memphis State All-American Keith Lee, one of the most dominant players in college basketball during his 4-year tenure at Memphis.
He is just doing it all. And he's not been out of the game. He hasn't had a rest all day.
He has put Memphis State basketball on the map.
He helped lead the Tigers to the Final Four this year, and with 21 or more wins since he arrived, they have finished in the top 10 in the final polls in each of his years there.
Lee is so tough when he's out around that foul line area because he can rebound well from there. He passes well, and he can make that jump shot.
Lee and Tisdale going head-to-head, and there is an All-American move by Keith Lee. As you have the crowd, great fake. He banks it over to Olajuwon and scores.
After Patrick Ewing, you will be the biggest impact player in the NBA draft this year.
A lot of people thought he was going to be a great pro basketball player.
Why did Keith Lee have so much trouble living up to his college ability?
Well,
Lee leaves behind many new pages in the Memphis State record book, the all-time leader in points, rebounds, block shots, and minutes played.
Keith Lee has saved that program.
Enough said. Let's jog your memory. This is Keith Lee, University of Memphis legend, perennial All-American, and during a golden era of college big men, he was one of the best. But if you're not familiar, that's okay. Let's start from the beginning. The future Memphis star would attend West Memphis High School, except this wasn't exactly in Memphis, it was in Arkansas. But as long as the school had Memphis in the name, Lee would be unstoppable. Alongside future NBAer Michael Cage, a junior Lee would help lead West Memphis to an undefeated 30-0 season and a state title. Cage graduated and left for college, and over the summer, a now senior Lee made his own college decision. Nothing was official, but he announced his intent to sign with Arkansas State. They were close to home, and they needed help. Lee also felt that stating his intentions now would keep other coaches away. Even though Cage was gone, Lee made sure West Memphis stayed on top. The undefeated streak continued, and Lee was the main reason for it. After a 22-0 start, West Memphis had set the state record for consecutive wins, with 52, dating back to last season, and by the end of this season, the streak had reached 60. On the back of Keith Lee, West Memphis had turned in another undefeated campaign, culminating in their second straight state title. Keith Lee was one of the best players the Memphis area had ever seen, and was one of the hottest recruits in the nation. And with signing day coming up, he was set to make his Arkansas State commitment official. But then some details came out that threatened that commitment. Keith Lee had every intention to sign with Arkansas State, but as the day came, Lee had to delay the signing. The reason reportedly being that the NCAA was investigating a possible violation. Lee worked as a part-time custodian, but the company he worked for happened to be owned by an ASU alumni, and the job was reportedly arranged by the school, a possible violation of NCAA rules. Ultimately, Lee was permitted to sign where he wanted, but he also didn't want any stress. It was the reason he announced his intent prior to his senior season. But maybe this situation affected him in some way, as in late April, he didn't commit to ASU. He committed to Memphis State, following his high school teammate Aaron Price. The Tigers had stolen a diamond. Keith Lee was one of the biggest signings in Memphis State history, and they needed someone like him to turn the program around. The Tigers had turned in 3 consecutive 13-win seasons. 2 of those had been under head coach Dana Kirk, but now he had his game changer to build around. The Keith Lee era had begun. Lee had impressed in some summer league action. Only problem was the naturally timid Lee was playing too much like his personality. Coaches wanted to see more, yet felt like it might take him his entire freshman year to develop that aggression. They told fans not to expect too much. But then Lee took the court. Inside or outside, his game was sound. The teenager looked like a polished big man, and the fans couldn't help but get their hopes up. Memphis State narrowly lost their first game. Lee still led the team in scoring and had the ball in his hands when Memphis needed a bucket. They lost game 2. Lee had some struggles, but then something clicked. Over the next 5 weeks, Memphis State didn't lose. They beat a ranked Louisiana team. They won 10 in a row. No one could stop Keith Lee. His arrival was changing the program, but he would never take the credit. It was always a team effort. Memphis State dropped a close one to Tulane, but that was one of just 2 Metro Conference losses. They worked their way into the national rankings and wrapped up the regular season with 20 wins and just 4 losses. Keith Lee was timid off the court, but on the court, he was making a very different name for himself. So good that the NBA was already looking like an option. For now, He was the best freshman and the best player in the Metro Conference. Lee and the Tigers followed up a regular season conference championship by defeating Louisville to win their first Metro Conference tournament title. Next was the big dance. Memphis State outlasted Wake Forest. Lee had 18 points, 8 boards, and 4 blocks. But foul trouble would limit Lee in the Sweet 16. He dropped 14, but he fouled out. Memphis State fell to Villanova in overtime. Lee ended his freshman year with averages of about 18.5 points, 11 rebounds, and 3.5 blocks per game. It had been a freshman season for the ages. Legendary Louisville coach Denny Crum was already looking at Lee as the best player in the nation. Bobby Knight just wanted to avoid him altogether. The pros could wait. Keith Lee was locked in at Memphis State, and the Tigers were just getting started. While Keith Lee had been the star of the show as a freshman, it wasn't just him. The Tigers had some high-scoring wings in forward Bobby Parks and guard Philip Doom Haynes. But now their starting point guard was graduated. Not to worry, Keith Lee made Memphis State an appealing destination, and that helped the Tigers land the Little General, aka Andre Turner. And just as expected, the Memphis State Tigers were a force. They won 11 straight to begin the season. Lee continued dominating. He was the conference's best rebounder and shot blocker for the second straight season, and he was still pouring in the points. Coaches were starting to accept the inevitable. It didn't matter what you did, you weren't going to stop Keith Lee. And now with an improved roster around him, the Tigers looked even better than last year, even capturing the nation's #1 ranking, then immediately falling to Virginia Tech. And as conference play was heating up, the Tigers were cooling down. Last year they ran the Metro. This year they struggled to go 500. It was another 20-win season, and Keith Lee was a first-team All-American, but he and the Tigers were focused on some redemption in the conference tourney, and Lee led the way with 18-11 in a win over Florida State. But less than a week after ending their season with a loss to Louisville, they ended the Metro tourney the same way, yet they would still get another bid to the NCAA tournament. And their first game brought a marquee matchup, Lee and the Tigers versus Patrick Ewing and the Georgetown Hoyas. Ewing had a great game, but Lee outplayed him. He finished with a game-high 28 points and 15 rebounds. Ewing was impressed, and Memphis State came out on top. Lee had gotten through one incredible big man, but next was Hakeem Olajuwon and the top-ranked Houston Cougars in the Sweet 16. Lee already wasn't going to have an easy day against Olajuwon, but Houston was sending everyone at him.
Look at that. He wants to shoot the ball.
And it was working. It was hard enough for Lee to get a shot off, and when he did, it was rarely a good look. He had some moments where he seemed to be heating up, but overall, Houston kept him in check, just 13 points from the All-American. The Cougars pulled away in the second half, and another season came to an end in the Sweet 16, as Lee's sophomore year ended with him averaging about 18.5 points, 11 rebounds, and 3 blocks per game. The loss was tough, but it wasn't causing anyone to lose faith in the Tigers.
Memphis State, watch out. They'll be in the Final Four next year, led by that man right there, Keith Lee.
They already had a superstar big man, and going into the '84 season, it looked like they had another one on the way. Tiger fans had been holding their breath all spring, wondering if Keith Lee would go pro, but they were able to breathe a big sigh of relief when Lee confirmed that not only was he returning, but he said he planned to stay for 2 years. Plenty of time to form a connection with top recruit William Bedford, the tallest player in Memphis State history. One of Lee's biggest weaknesses up to this point had been his weight. Standing nearly 7 feet tall, he had played his first 2 seasons weighing less than 200 pounds. So many were happy when he added some weight going into his junior season. And it was making a difference. Lee was still more agile than most other big men. He had some of the softest hands of any player, regardless of size, and could get off the ground quickly for rebounds and putbacks. But with his added weight, he was spending more time inside, settling for less jumpers, and turning in the most efficient shooting season of his career. Like usual, Lee paced the conference in rebounding and blocks, and was Memphis State's leading scorer by a large margin. And at nearly 35 minutes per game, he was a workhorse. Memphis was touted as a championship contender, but got out to a slower start than expected. After 10 games, they were 7-3, and coming off an embarrassing loss to Iowa. But then they flipped the switch. and rattled off 12 straight wins, including a game against an Oklahoma Sooners team led by Wayman Tisdale. And in the Battle of the All-Americans, Keith Lee was king, a monster stat line, and a win. All in all, it was somewhat expected from Lee. Obviously, he was one of the best players in the nation, but the OU game was televised, and when Lee was on TV, you knew you were going to get a little something extra. Memphis State was rolling. The Bedford and Lee combo was getting better with every game. The Tigers had a pair of giants that commanded attention on both ends of the floor. Memphis State's streak putting them right back among the nation's best. And while they went 2-3 to end the year, it was a 21-win regular season. The Tigers reclaimed their throne as Metro Conference regular season champs. Sort of. But they went for full reign in the conference tourney. The quarterfinals were a cakewalk. Memphis State easily getting through Southern Mississippi. But the semis against Florida State were a different story. The Tigers were behind most of the game. And while Lee had 18 points, he fouled out late. Yet a last-second shot would push the Tigers through to the Metro Tournament Championship. And Keith Lee was due for a signature game.
Keith Lee has been Mr. Everything here today. He's putting on a show. Lee with 35 points today, 13 rebounds and 6 blocks. Now take your hat off to him. He did it.
Keith Lee did it all. Virginia Tech had no answer. The big man poured in a single-game tournament record 35 points. He added 13 boards and 6 blocks. And the Tigers won easily, Metro champs once again. And to make things even better for Lee, he became a father just 8 hours later. And now Memphis State was heating up at the right time, entering the NCAA tournament with a first-round matchup with Oral Roberts. Memphis State hadn't played a first-round tournament game since Lee's arrival. Oral Roberts put up a great fight, but Memphis State's resident All-American led the way with 26 points and 11 boards. The Tigers were on to the second round to take on Purdue. This game was no competition. Purdue was scared, and they were right to be. Lee dominated with 29 and 16, and for the third straight year, Memphis State was in the Sweet 16, taking on the same opponent who knocked them out last year. Just like last year, the Cougars sold out on stopping Lee. He rarely had any room to breathe. His 15 points, a big step back from the nearly 28 points he had been averaging over the first 2 games. He did add 10 boards and 6 blocks, but he fouled out late, and Memphis State just couldn't survive Hakeem Olajuwon. Another season came to an end in the Sweet 16, and Lee finished a second-team All-American season with averages of about 18.5 points, 11 rebounds, and 2.5 blocks per game. Lee was still one of the best players in the nation, and over the spring, he was invited to try out for the US Olympic team, an opportunity he would ultimately decide against, the reason being that his mother's health was declining, choosing instead to be with her. And soon after that, he made it official, announcing his return to Memphis for his senior season. On the court, he knew it was the best Tigers team he had ever been a part of, but he also wanted his degree. The pros were still his plan, but later in life, he wanted to coach as well. Finishing his degree was also for his mother. Getting an education was more important to her than basketball. Sadly, she would never get a chance to see her son walk across the stage.
For Keith Lee, it was more difficult. His father left home, and this fall, his mother died.
Lee had returned for his senior season, even heavier than last year, adding 25 more pounds to match his 6'10 frame. Maybe even a little too heavy. But Coach Dana Kirk still knew that the only thing that could stop Keith Lee was himself, his Achilles heel being his constant foul trouble. And as a whole, Memphis State had a starting 5 that could stack up to anyone. Lee was their unquestioned superstar.
There's Keith Lee, 43rd man in NCAA history to score 2,000 and rebound 1,000.
But a second-year Bedford gave Memphis State arguably the best forward-center duo in the country. Andre Turner was still the man who made everything go. And the Tigers rounded it out with an underrated wing tandem of junior Baskerville Holmes and freshman Vincent Askew. Memphis State was the conference favorite from day one, and you couldn't argue that with the way they were playing. On the back of Keith Lee, they won 16 of their first 17. Very few of those wins were ever in question. Things on the court were a bit different for Lee. He had spent a good amount of his first 3 years playing center, but now with Bedford coming into his own, Lee would play his more natural 4. On defense, his block and rebounding numbers suffered as Bedford patrolled the paint, yet Lee would still lead the conference in rebounding for the 4th consecutive season. But now on offense, Lee didn't always have to play close to the basket. He could step out and play more of his natural finesse game, scoring from inside and out, as he averaged a career-high 19.7 points, leading the conference in scoring for the first time. And he did all of this while routinely facing double and even triple teams. Lee was rewriting the record books, turning in one of the most prolific college careers ever.
And the more that's needed out of him, the more he gives you.
The most dominant player in Memphis State history.
How many times have we seen Keith Lee, when they need him, come through?
And the Tigers were just as dominant in conference play, losing their opener to South Carolina, then never losing again. Their 13-1 record against Metro opponents would secure them another regular season title. Keith Lee earned his 2nd Conference Player of the Year and his 2nd first-team All-American selection. Then, after defeating Southern Miss in the Metro Tourney quarterfinals, they completed a season sweep of Louisville, a team who had given Memphis State a lot of trouble throughout Lee's career, as Lee scored 18 points in the win. And finally, in the championship game versus Florida State, Lee dropped 19, and the Tigers pulled it out in overtime. This was a great way to end his Metro career, but it was more important for Lee and the Tigers to make it past the Sweet 16. Memphis State was a tournament favorite, but Lee had ended the season in a shooting slump. The Tigers beat Penn in round 1, but foul trouble limited Lee to 20 minutes and 8 points. Everything seemed back to normal in round 2 versus UAB. Lee dropped 28 points on over 70% shooting. He fouled out late, but Andre Turner saved the day in overtime. Memphis State was back in the Sweet 16, this time needing to get through Boston College. But Lee fell back in his slump. He shot 3 of 12 from the field. He scored 8 points. Boston College had a chance to win until Andre Turner came to the rescue again. It wasn't pretty, but Lee had finally made it past the Sweet 16, and now it was a battle of the All-Americans in the Elite 8, Lee's Tigers versus Tisdale's Sooners. Luckily, Lee again broke out of his slump. He scored a game-high 23 points and pulled down 11 boards. The Memphis State defense held Tisdale to 11 points, and the Tigers pulled out a 2-point win, the first 30-win season in program history. Next stop, the Final Four. Lee had another tough matchup with Villanova's Ed Pinckney, but again, Lee struggled. He scored a couple points early, but wasn't all that effective. He was up to 10 points with about 10 minutes left in the game, and then he fouled out. Memphis State kept fighting, but without Lee for that long, they couldn't survive another one. Lee's college career ended on the bench, and his senior season ended with averages of about 19.5 points, 9 rebounds, and 1.5 blocks per game. Keith Lee had wrapped up the best career in Memphis State history.
They've already retired this young man's jersey at Memphis State.
He had transformed them into a national power, and going into the 1985 NBA draft, he was a top prospect, considered one of the nation's best big men, alongside the likes of Georgetown's Patrick Ewing and Oklahoma's Wayman Tisdale. Lee still had his criticisms.
And one of the problems you had near the end of the year was foul trouble. You're probably looking forward to the fact that you'll have 6 fouls in pro basketball.
Then I think the NBA game is more physical than the college game, and the refs will let you play in the NBA.
But what was hurting him the most was that he didn't attend any pre-draft camps. He was still a first rounder, but where would he go? Lee was selected by the Chicago Bulls 11th overall, but was immediately traded to the Cleveland Cavaliers for fellow draftee Charles Oakley. The Cavs were happy with their choice, and Cleveland gave Lee $1 million. The rookie forward now joining a Cavs team led by veteran guard World B. Free, yet Lee's season got off to a late start. A nagging thigh injury kept Lee out of action to begin the year. He wasn't on the court, and it was hard to even get a glimpse of the notoriously shy Lee. He finally made his debut in mid-December, beginning his career coming off the bench and playing very low minutes. Then on January 24th, he got his first start. He dropped 25 points and pulled down 11 boards. But the very next game he went 1 for 9 and got put right back on the bench. He cracked the starting lineup for good a few games later, but his production was underwhelming. He had his moments, yet struggled with the speed of the game. and playing big minutes in an 82-game season was proving to be no easy task. But he ended the year strong, finally looking acclimated to the game. He averaged a double-double on 55% shooting over his final 8 games in April. Cleveland lost most of those games, a common theme for their season, as the Cavs finished at 29-53, missing the playoffs, with Lee ending his rookie year with averages of about 7.5 points, 6 rebounds, and half a block per game. It was a new era of Cavs basketball the following year. The organization had one of the best drafts in NBA history, then brought in Lenny Wilkens to coach the team, but this didn't bode well for Lee. Wilkens returned him to the bench and didn't show much urgency to make him a part of the game plan all season. But Lee also wasn't showing much improvement, his dedication coming into question.
But they are now thinking that he's really going to have to learn how to apply himself and do those things, dedication, whatever the word I'm looking for, that it takes to be a great player.
Keith Lee was no longer bigger and stronger than most of his opponents.
Well, in college, he's a big kid, and in college he was bigger than a lot of the people he played against. But he's just going to have to dedicate himself to do what it takes to become a good player in this league. That's a lot of sacrifice.
The Cavs had their #1 pick, Brad Daugherty, at center. Lee's draft mate John Hot Rod Williams hadn't played last year. This year he was a day 1 starter, and the Cavs were a better team with this front line. Lee had become the odd man out on a Cavs team totaling 31 wins. No playoffs, but improvement, with Lee's second season ending with averages of about 6 points, 3.5 rebounds, and half a block per game. After the season, Lee was gone. In June, the Cavs sent him to the Blazers for Jim Paxson, but days later, the trade was invalidated. Portland found that Lee's knees were deteriorating. The forward was suffering from tendinitis. Lee remained a Cav, but just a few months later, Cleveland found a taker, and Lee was sent to New Jersey. But back issues would sideline Lee indefinitely before the year began. Ultimately, it kept him out all season. During that time, he also had leg surgery. Keith Lee's once great reputation had taken a serious hit. He wouldn't make his Nets debut until November of 1988, yet he had gotten himself into better shape, ready to prove the doubters wrong. Unfortunately, his body was still letting him down. He just couldn't escape the injuries and couldn't handle big minutes. When he was feeling good, he sometimes looked like the Keith Lee of old, but those moments were few and far between. His 57 games were the lowest of his career. The Nets were one of the worst teams in the league. Keith Lee's first season in New Jersey ended with him averaging about 4 points, 4.5 rebounds, and half a block per game. After the season, Lee was selected by the Orlando Magic in the 1989 expansion draft, but he never received a contract offer. Over the next 6 years, Lee would suit up for a variety of teams in a variety of leagues, but would never return to the NBA, his career officially lasting 3 seasons. In post-retirement, he's kept a very low profile, but in more recent years, he returned to Memphis and coached at Raleigh Egypt High School. College basketball fans in the 80s and Memphis and Arkansas natives will never forget Keith Lee, but he's seldom talked about today, mostly because his Memphis career ended with an unfortunate blemish. Scandal erupted shortly after Lee's senior season. It was alleged and later confirmed that Lee and others had been paid throughout their time with the program. Further violations were discovered, and wins were vacated. The most memorable period of Memphis basketball was being wiped from the history books. And in turn, so was Keith Lee's legendary career. His NBA career didn't go at all as hoped, but he still made it to the NBA. Yet that's not what makes Keith Lee so special. Scandal or not, those 4 years at Memphis State will never be erased. During a golden era of college basketball, Keith Lee was one of the most dominant players to take the court. From his first game as a freshman to his Final Four loss as a senior, Keith Lee was the franchise. But that's it for today's episode on Keith Lee. Hope you enjoyed it, and make sure to subscribe for more videos like this one. If you liked it, check out this one on one of his 85 draft mates, or this one on a Cleveland Cavaliers teammate. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.